بسم الله إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره وأتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As you must have seen from the title, this presentation is intended to clarify in simple terms the concept of what it means to be a Mujahid and a Shaheed, that is, a martyr from an Islamic perspective. This concept, even though basic, are misunderstood and abused by the vast majority of those who hold a claim to Islam. I got the inspiration for this presentation upon the mass elimination of the leaders of Hizbullah, the Hizb of Shaitan, as well as the recent elimination of Yahya Sinwar, who was the leader of Hamas, who many who claim to be Muslim believe to be a Shaheed. Who is a Mujahid? A Mujahid is a person who fights solely in the way of Allah Jalla Jalal to make His word supreme. A Mujahid is someone who fights and strives in the way of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to establish His religion on earth, to ensure its supremacy and superiority over every religion, systems, and ways. Who then isn't a Mujahid? If a Mujahid is someone who fights solely in the way of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, then whoever fights for any other cause most certainly isn't a Mujahid. Those who fight for land, or nationalism, or tribalism, or secularism, or democracy, or communism, or any other isms and false ways are most certainly not Mujahideen. The cause for which you fight and the banner under which you fight is what qualifies or disqualifies you as a Mujahid. Simply claiming to be Muslim, but then fighting and striving for a nationalistic cause or any other cause that isn't solely intended for the supremacy of Islam and the Muslims disqualifies a person as a Mujahid. Hey, I'm a Muslim, but here I am fighting for some bullshit cause. I'm definitely a Mujahid, aren't I? Wow, I'm so brave. This is complete nonsense. Wallahi, this is complete nonsense. The striving for anything other than the supremacy of the religion of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala and the supremacy of His Sharia revealed to His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is definitely not jihad fi sabilillah. It is a complete waste of time and effort for which those engaged in it would get no reward. This would include groups like Hamas or the Taliban or Hezbollah. This would also include the armies of the so-called Muslim countries such as Saudi, the UAE, Egypt, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., as well as any other so-called Muslim country or any other country for that matter that claims to have Muslims in its army. The Saudi army, just like the armies of all other so-called Muslim countries, are armies of Taghut and armies of Shaitan. They are armies that fight in the cause of Kufri nationalism and secularism. The Taliban, for example, were Mujahideen, inshallah ta'ala, they were Mujahideen under the leadership of Mullah Umar, rahimahullah. However, from what is apparent of the Taliban today, they do not fit the description of Mujahideen, as they are no different from the other so-called Muslim countries who bend over backwards for the kuffar and have no izzah to oppose and stand in opposition to the status quo. They are all forces of Taghut and Shaitan, no different than the armies of the kuffar countries who fight for nationalistic causes. Ask yourself, if the so-called Muslims are fighting for Jahili causes such as nationalism and secularism, which are no different from the causes the kuffar fight for, then what differentiates the Muslims from the kuffar? Ask yourself this. That a certain country has a sword and shahada on its flag doesn't make it a land of tawheed or its soldiers mujahideen. So just having la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam on your flag and then having a sword on your flag And then that doesn't necessarily mean that those who fight for that land are mujahideen, because at the end of the day, is the La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah on the flag, is it just for show? Or are you really the forces of Islam? Are you really those who strive to bring victory to the religion? Or are you just like any of the other Muslim countries who just bends over backwards to the United States or the UK or France or any of these foreign powers like China and Russia, for example? This is a question you need to ask yourself as a Muslim. The only true mujahideen today are those slandered the most as Khawarij and agents of America and Israel, those known as the Islamic State. They are the only ones who meet the criteria to be called mujahideen. And the kuffar and munafiqun have purposely spread lies and slander about them to brainwash and mislead the masses of those who claim to be Muslim from this fact. It's important to understand the importance of Aqidah in the context of those who fit the description of mujahideen. Every Muslim must reject every form of Taghut as a matter of Aqidah. If you do not reject the authority of the secular so-called rulers of the so-called Muslim countries, as well as the deviant and kufri systems in place in these countries, which are Taghut systems, then you are outside of the fold of Islam. And this is something every Muslim needs to put into consideration. You have to think about this a lot. You have to understand this in very simple terms. Similarly, anyone who fights for them or their systems is an apostate and a disbeliever, and definitely not a mujahid. So I hope, inshallah, that I've made it very clear what a mujahid is and what a mujahid isn't. Now that we know who a mujahid is and who isn't a mujahid, let's now get to the next part of this presentation. Who then is a shaheed? If a mujahid is someone who fights and strives solely in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then a shaheed is someone who dies or is killed upon this path. As we know from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are multiple avenues by which one can attain shahada. This is with the caveat, though, that such a person is upon the correct aqidah. When I say aqidah, I'm not referring to all the Ash'ari, Maturidi, Athari nonsense, which 95% of those who hold a claim to Islam would never even think of until you start shoving it in their faces. When I say aqidah, I'm simply referring to the basic beliefs and practice of the religion. The belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the pillars of Islam, the articles of faith. From aqidah is a rejection of Taghut, as we've previously touched on. Anyone who meets this overarching umbrella of belief and aqidah and then dies from any of the multiple avenues which shahada can be attained as described by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is indeed a shaheed bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Who then isn't a shaheed? Whoever dies or is killed for any other cause than to make the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest, or dies by any of the other means by which shahada can be attained, but is upon a corrupt and deviant aqidah, is definitely not a shaheed. This now brings us to the subject of Yahya Sinwar and the genocide in Palestine. From what is apparent, the likes of Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh are definitely not shuhada. They represented secularism and nationalism, and this disqualify them from the status of a mujahid or a shaheed. From what is apparent, those killed from the forces of the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah are not shuhada. Of the Sunnis from amongst their ranks, the most that could be hoped for them is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts their claim to Islam. If there are fighters in Palestine who die fighting solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reject all kufr systems and isms, then they die as shuhada bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. What then is the condition of the tens of thousands who claim to be Muslims, of those killed in Palestine as well as other places and regions all over the world? Those who claim to be Muslims but do not reject the Taghut systems, but instead die believing in Kufri systems such as democracy, secularism, communism, etc., do not die as Shuhada. In their case as well, the most that could be hoped for them is that their claim to Islam is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is an extremely basic concept in the religion of Islam. But for some reason, most of those who hold a claim to Islam seem not to understand this. As brutal and grievous as the plight of the Palestinians is, it is the Islamic principles that determines who is a Shaheed, not emotions. The only group of Muslims today whose killed fighters, members, and leaders fulfill the conditions of Shahada as a whole is the Islamic State. As strange as this might sound to you, due to the massive propaganda and lies spread about them, this is the cold fact. Those killed from the Islamic State are Shaheed, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. And those who the Islamic State kills, maybe not all of them, but the vast majority, because you have to put into consideration, for example, the collateral damage. So if you put into consideration the collateral damage that might have killed actual true Muslims, then we can say for certain that most of those who have been killed by the Islamic State are in Jahannam. Because if they are upon the truth, then those who oppose them and those who they fight and those who they kill are upon falsehood. So the soldiers of the nation states who fight for secularism and nationalism, who have fought against the Islamic State and have died fighting against them, they are all in Jahannam. Because as Rasulullah says, the Mujahid and the kafir who he kills are never united in Jahannam. So this is something that might sound strange to you, but if you give it some thought, then you might understand what I'm trying to say, inshallah ta'ala. And finally, it's important to understand that the situation of the Ummah will only continue to worsen until we disbelieve in all forms of Taghut, all forms of Kufri systems and isms, and stand behind those who reject the Taghut in all its forms. The Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will not attain victory and will continue to get slaughtered and massacred until we stand behind those who fight solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His religion. I'm going to repeat myself. The Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will never attain victory and will continue to get slaughtered and massacred until we stand behind those who fight solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His religion. The US won't help you. Neither will the EU or the UN or Russia or Iran or China or any of the so-called Muslim countries. Only Allah Azza wa Jal and those who fight and strive solely for His sake will. The earlier you realize and understand this, the better. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.